Okay, so if we're talking about anthropologists being engaged in a very personal level with their informants and their study community, that might clue you into some ethical considerations that come into play. So the information we gather, this cultural knowledge and personal knowledge, can oftentimes be sensitive information. Whether you're researching something that involves illegal behavior, or you're just researching something that may cause some damage to reputation, or even if you're just talking about basic life histories, there might be some sensitive information in there. So anthropologists are kind of facing these ethical considerations, some ethical problems. And so we want to talk about that just a little bit here at the end of this lecture. And as we move through each topic, we'll kind of touch on that as well. So when we talk about race and identity or gender and identity, we'll talk about ethics again in that context, because it's always something anthropologists have to keep in mind. Okay, and so we also talked about anthropologists are now shifting and starting to do more work in their own communities, in Western communities, as opposed to far-off places. Remember that that research does still occur in very remote places, but there's also a lot of research happening at home in our own communities. Okay, so what kind of benefits and drawbacks might there be? So working in your own community, you're going to be already familiar with the language and customs, right? So you've grown up in that community, you've been enculturated in that community, so you are aware of language, customs, behaviors, norms, and those sorts of things, which really help you build a rapport with the community you're in. So you don't have to learn all of those things. There's not these cultural blunders or missteps that you've been reading about in your textbook, because you already are aware of all of those norms in the culture. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, that might blind you to some patterns or situations that an outsider might see. So that's one of the benefits of being an insider-outsider, balancing that perspective as an anthropologist, is that as an outsider, you do see some different behaviors that might be overlooked by an insider. Okay, so if you're studying your own community, yes, you're going to blend in, you're going to fit in well, it's going to be easier to bridge that gap between yourself and your study community, but at the same time, you might also overlook some social processes, behaviors, and those sorts of things. Okay? So like it says there, being an outsider, struggling to understand and trying to make sense of this new community can actually be a benefit to the anthropologist. Okay? And so one way to overcome this within your own community is to study social conflict, as opposed to just basic patterns of normal behavior. Okay, because social conflict often brings about complaints or makes us feel uncomfortable because some norm is being violated. And so those help to highlight basic cultural assumptions. So an anthropologist named Laura Nader and her husband studied consumer complaints about products. And so people writing reviews or complaining to a company about their products actually highlighted basic American values of fairness and accountability because they were upset. And so it brought about these values very clearly. So these values had been violated in the eyes of the customer. And so for them to complain about it, they had to recognize that the value had been violated, and that made the value more clear to the researcher. Okay, so working in your own community can be difficult because you might overlook some of these things. So to overcome that, we often will study social conflict because it really just highlights those basic values and assumptions. Okay. Some other ethical dilemmas we might face, and these are across study regions, so in your own community or outside of the community. Anthropologists have a very strong commitment to do no harm. And we are in communities that are often disadvantaged or are struggling in some way or another, and we are gathering, like I said, this very personal information or sensitive information. So we always have the goal of doing no harm. That is our commitment, our utmost commitment, to do no harm. Some anthropologists say we should go further, and we should actually, instead of doing no harm, we should aim to do good. Okay? Because anthropologists are in this unique position where we can kind of bridge the gap between the dominant culture and a subculture or a disadvantaged population, and we can advocate for those people on a scale at which they couldn't do on their own, or we could work with that community to help them advocate for themselves. And so we have a little bit more political power than the average community just by being academics and having our foot in that world and in the Western world because of our academic status. Okay, so some anthropologists go a bit further and say that instead of doing no harm, we should always aim to do good. Okay, and then you have to think about to whom are you responsible when you're doing this research. Okay, and then who controls your findings. So as an academic, you're doing research, you most likely will have someone funding your research. And it's not going to be the study community, most likely. Okay, so if you're entering a community to do research, you're being funded by someone or some company or organization. And so who do you report to? And to whom are you responsible? Okay, it always should be the people you are working with, your informants in your community. Okay, it's always to them. So they come first, their needs, their wants, their lives come before the research, come before the institution you're working with or for. Okay, and then there's discussions about who controls the anthropologist's findings. Is it you as the anthropologist? Is it the community that you are working with? Is it the organization funding your research? I'm in the camp that the data that you gather, the raw data, the information you're collecting, isn't yours. It already belongs to a community. So the cultural information you gather is theirs to have. It's their culture. You're writing down their lives, their histories, their stories, their experiences. It is theirs. So I'm in the camp that it belongs to them, and that data should be theirs. Okay, I think it should be theirs to control. Your interpretation of the data with their permission and working with the community should be maybe a little bit more in your control. But I think there's always room for collaboration and working together between the anthropologist and the community. But I think ultimately you are borrowing that community's life data and cultural knowledge to prove a point or to suggest a theory. And so it is their information that you are essentially borrowing, in my opinion. Okay, so then who controls those findings? And as we move towards, remember we talked about action research or participatory action research, in that realm, it's 100% the study community. You're working with them from beginning to end of the process to help develop research that is beneficial for them. So then they control those findings and who should have access to them, which I think is a very empowering method and way of working with the community, and goes back to bullet number 1 up here, that we shouldn't just do no harm, we should be doing good as well.